Picking up from our last discussion on Enlightenment historiography and metaphor, we find ourselves right in the thick of it. The 17th century wasn't exactly a walk in the park for historians. Imagine trying to write history when you feel like you're standing in a massive, swirling storm of clashing forces, religious, political, cultural. That's the vibe. You couldn't just be neutral, you had to pick a side or at least serve one. Whether it was church history or the accounts penned by missionaries and conquistadors mapping new lands, the air was thick with division. This wasn't just some minor quirk. It was the default setting, what the text calls the historiography of essential schism. History wasn't seen as a unified story, but a battleground. Now, faced with this historical free-for-all, people started looking for ways out. Two main paths emerged. First, you had the erudite antiquarians. Think dusty libraries, meticulous footnotes, the pursuit of perfect objectivity. Their big idea: if things are chaotic, let's just list them in order. Boom, the analytic mode was born. History becomes a simple timeline. A happened, then B, then C. Order, unity? Just sequential arrangement. Leibniz, bless his heart, kind of liked this approach, sees it as a bulwark against the philosopher's view of society as fundamentally broken and atomized. His own idea of harmony between opposites, well, maybe a bit naive as the text puts it. The other path was more about style than substance. Enter the historians gallants, the fancy gentleman historians. They wanted to be above the fray, detached from party politics. But how? By basically saying, look, this whole truth business is for scientists and philosophers. We're just here for the aesthetics. It's like saying, I'm not trying to explain the universe. I'm just trying to make pretty patterns. A purely aesthetic escape. But then came the philosophers, the heavy hitters of the Enlightenment. They had a different game plan, the ironic mode. This is where things get really interesting. On one hand, they desperately wanted objectivity, to stand back and observe coolly. On the other hand, they were secretly, perhaps unconsciously, aware that this was impossible. It's like wanting to be completely impartial while writing a scathing review of someone's work. Tough luck. They were heavily influenced by Newtonian science. Everything has a cause. Everything follows laws. So they looked at history as a giant causal machine. What were the causes? Reason versus unreason. And the effects? Enlightened folks versus superstitious or ignorant ones. Simple, right? Let's break down this ironic system. Think of it like building blocks. The lexical elements are the basic units, people acting as individuals or groups. The syntax is how these units connect. They fall neatly into two camps: the carriers of irrational values, superstitious, ignorant, and the carriers of enlightened or rational values. The relationship between these camps, unremitting conflict. It's a constant battle. And the semantic meaning, the punchline? The triumph of reason over unreason. Or, depending on your perspective, the reverse. It's a binary opposition, a clash of titans. Here's the kicker, the logical trap they fell into. Neither looking around at the messy reality of their time, nor digging into the historical record, could definitively prove or disprove this neat reason versus unreason narrative. So, what happens? The Enlightenment's own thinking gets pulled back, dragged kicking and screaming from its initial relatively straightforward cause and effect view, metonymy, into this ironic questioning stance. Why? Because if you start by framing everything as an effect of some cause, you end up concluding that everything is ultimately contingent, determined by prior causes. And if everything is determined, then nothing is truly rational in its essence. It's all just, well, effects. It's like trying to build a house on sand. The foundation crumbles under the weight of its own logic. Faced with this inescapable irony, what do the Enlightenment thinkers do? They retreat into art, just like the previous century had done. But their idea of art was neoclassical. Think strict rules, order, and above all, causation and law. Art for them mirrored science. So, the inevitable result? Historical writing became purely satirical. No grand tragedies here, why not? Because tragedy usually needs that heroic flaw, that tragic hero whose excessive virtue leads to downfall. But in the Enlightenment worldview, everything had a cause. There was no room for existential paradoxes, those lived contradictions that define true tragedy. Thinkers and artists couldn't conceive of life being fundamentally absurd or contradictory in the way needed for tragedy. Even comedy leaned towards the lighter, new comedy style of Menander, avoiding the high seriousness of Aristophanes' old comedy, which grappled with deeper truths. So, let's zoom out and summarize the Enlightenment's historical mindset. The core was a metonymical approach, seeing the world as a web of cause and effect. To make sense of it, they used metaphorical labels, naming things, and syndochic shortcuts, treating individuals as representatives of types, like the Frenchman. But the final outcome, the meaning they derived, was ironic. It's almost a rule: if you start analyzing history purely through cause and effect, the logic of that very method pushes you towards an ironic, perhaps skeptical, understanding. They shifted from seeing history governed by universal laws, nomological, to seeing it as a series of human types, typological, basically, reason versus unreason. Their storytelling started epic, a grand contest, then dipped into comic or tragic possibilities, but ultimately settled on satire because they couldn't sustain the dogma required for genuine tragedy or comedy. Satire, though, is a tricky tool. It can be used to poke fun at the old guard, conservative purposes, or the new kids on the block, liberal purposes. The Enlightenment thinkers, with their ironic detachment, could have served either side, but honestly, not very effectively. Why? Because their irony made them realize that the specific truths they uncovered were ambiguous. They weren't discovering grand universal laws, they were just observing cycles. As the saying goes, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things that change, the more they stay the same. This limited view meant that when democratic forces started bubbling up, the philosophers often saw them as just as frightening and reprehensible as the aristocracy they'd originally criticized. They simply couldn't wrap their heads around the possibility of genuine transformative change. This brings us to Kant. He was sharp enough to see the inherent irony in how the Enlightenment approached history. Treating historical understanding as a kind of fiction with moral weight that was Kant recognizing the age's predicament. Interestingly, Kant's own ironic defense of science opened doors for later thinkers. Similarly, his analysis of historical thought paved the way for reviving ideas like organicism, which we'll meet soon. Now, Kant himself had opinions. He didn't like Fichte's idealism because it seemed like science was just a projection of the mind's will. And he had reservations about Herder's organicism, the idea that change and transformation are fundamental to life. Kant worried that if change is primary, then asking whether history is progressing becomes meaningless. Nietzsche later came along and categorized historical sensibilities based on what he called temporal yearning. 3 types. First, the antiquarian, who loves the old stuff just because it's old, giving us roots and reverence. Think museum curators. Second, the monumental, chasing the great, the heroic, the powerful examples of human creativity and transformation. This is future-focused, often dismissing the past. Think biographers of heroes. Third, the critical historian, judging both the past and future dreams, working for the present, cultivating oblivion so we can actually act now. Think many modern historians. The Enlightenment produced bits of all 3, but it was weakest on the monumental, the hero-serving stuff. Why? Because while they believed in humanity, they didn't really trust individual men. They lacked that confidence in the heroic figure. So, where did the Enlightenment go wrong? They started with a metaphorical, ironic awareness, recognizing the limits of human knowledge and action. But they didn't run with it. They didn't fully embrace their own imaginative power. For them, imagination was dangerous, a threat to cold, hard reason. Nietzsche, on the other hand, was fully aware that his perceptions were, in a sense, fictions. He used his imagination, his Waneric powers, to create new myths, powerful narratives that served life. The Enlightenment, stuck in their rationalist cage, never quite grasped that earlier myths and legends might contain kernels of truth, however incomplete. They couldn't immerse themselves in the divine mystery Herder celebrated, or the human mystery Vico explored. They stayed safely outside, looking in. Enter Johann Gottfried Herder, ready to rebel. He saw the dead end of Enlightenment mechanism and its ironic conclusion. His weapon? Naive metaphor, the kind of thinking at the heart of myth. But don't mistake this for simple-mindedness. Herder was doing this consciously, trying to recover the unique individual spark in history. He looked at the historical field and saw an infinite ocean of random events, causes unknowable, origins miraculous. It looked chaotic, casual. But Herder couldn't accept that as the final word. He insisted, perhaps, for religious or metaphysical reasons, that beneath this apparent chaos lay a deeper, spiritually superior order, a purpose that guaranteed ultimate unity. He wanted to escape the trap of pure causality. Herder searched for the principle behind this harmony, but carefully avoided explaining it purely through physical or causal terms. That would lead back to irony. Instead, he found limited formal coherencies among the individuals and groups he studied, nations, cultures, etc. He treated these as putatively concrete universals. Think of them as unique entities, like France, that also represent a type or category. This makes Herder's thought both individualistic, celebrating the unique, and typological, seeing patterns. It connects him to Romanticism, the individual, and idealism, the universal type. His philosophy is organicist. The individual and the type are equally real, both expressions of a spiritual force, God, responsible for their integrity and eventual harmony within a larger cosmic whole. For Herder, the cycle of birth and death wasn't a problem to be solved. It was part of the process. Coming into being and passing away weren't just natural events. They were spiritual processes too, happening simultaneously. Both were precious ways the unified organic force integrated existence. Death wasn't an end but a transition. Look at his famous line from the Idean: man is the middle ring between two adjoining systems of creation. He's the highest link of earthly creation, but also the lowest link of a higher order. This explains the contradiction. He's an animal attached to earth, yet a human with seeds of immortality. Wise men ripple the waters, fools inherit wisdom. The noblest are often the least successful. It's a complex picture where the mind reflects the universe, transcending space and time. How does Herder handle that nasty, ironic conclusion? The idea that the noblest are often the most discontented and ineffective. He cleverly neutralizes it. He takes the contradiction of human nature, being the highest creature yet constantly conflicted, and reframes it as an apparent bipolarity. It's not a real contradiction needing explanation, but something to be explained away. It justifies believing humans inhabit both natural and spiritual realms, linking them, and aspiring beyond time and space. By appealing to long-term harmonization, he dismisses the immediate tension. His thought dances between celebrating the individual's unique journey, romantic appeal, and seeing the whole as a collection of types moving towards an ideal, idealist appeal. What was Herder's lasting impact, especially on how history was studied? Well, he basically drained causality of its power when it came to understanding human affairs. For him, causality was mainly for physics and animals. This annoyed the positivists, but appealed to later idealists and neo-Kantians, who saw different kinds of sciences for different domains. Hegel, though, wasn't fully convinced. He agreed change was key, but felt Herder and others hadn't given a satisfying account of what change meant for human life, its direction, its purpose. Herder's focus on formal coherence, while elegant, was seen as morally limited. It stopped short of providing a deeper meaning. This very limitation signaled a need for something new, a return to mythic thinking, but in a modern guise. Herder, along with other thinkers of his time, shared a desire to break free from Enlightenment constraints. Herder's real significance lies in his methodology. He gave historians a technique: how to look at the historical field as a collection of unique individuals and groups, each articulating itself in its own way. How could this technique be used? If you focus on the individuals, you get romantic history, think Humboldt, Ranke, Hegel. If you use the individuals to study the underlying spirit or type they represent, you get idealist history, Fichte, Schelling, Schlegel. But there's a third path: detach the technique from any spiritual agenda, and make the study of this simultaneous grasp of individual uniqueness and formal coherence itself the object of study. That's historism. It defines historical explanation as describing the formal coherence shown by an individuality. And historism, ironically, ended up having its own set of ideological baggage. Ernst Cassirer, a later thinker, highlighted Herder's breakthrough. He said Herder broke the spell of Enlightenment thinking, which was obsessed with analysis and identity. A is A. Herder showed that history isn't about identical things recurring. It's about new creatures constantly emerging, each with its own unique shape. Abstract generalizations? Powerless against history's richness. Every phase of history has its own validity. Yet Herder also stressed unity. These diverse phases aren't separate. They exist only through the whole. Unity comes not from sameness, but from the process itself. Herder's gifts? A deep appreciation for diversity, a sense of unity within it, and replacing static structure with dynamic process as the key to understanding history's totality. But Herder tried to do too much. He wanted to merge the natural and historical worlds under one grand system of causes. Listen to this passage from his Edene. The law that formed crystals and worms also formed humanity. All of God's works are stable, consistent, resting on equilibrium. Everywhere I look in history, I see divine harmony. What can happen, happens. What can operate, operates. Reason endures, madness destroys. The image is powerful, a system that's growing yet orderly, energetic yet stable, developing yet systematic. It implies everything that ever existed was perfectly suited to its conditions. Herder loved the idea that what can occur, does occur, what can operate, operates. It suggests a predetermined, harmonious unfolding. This leads to Herder's attitude towards time. He tells us not to worry about providential or retrospective concerns. Things are what they must be, given their environment. All that can be is, all that can come to be will be. Time doesn't threaten him, it's internalized. Things fade when their time is up, not because some external time demands it. Look at his description of California natives, slovenly, yes, but cheerful, laughing, active, indifferent to death. He finds redeeming qualities everywhere. He judges nothing. Evil and suffering judge themselves through their failure to endure. The law of the whole applies to every part. Nothing is arbitrary, the historian's job, humility in the face of this incredible diversity. Of course, Herder's system had critics. Lovejoy pointed out a weakness. If everything was always adequate to its conditions, why did things ever change? Herder struggled to explain the necessity of change within his framework. Lovejoy argued Herder basically turned change and duration into sacred mysteries, manifestations of this mysterious, unified organic force. Kant, ever the critic, called it unscientific. The idea of a self-constituting organic force governing everything. That's speculative philosophy, not empirical science, Kant declared. It would mess up established ideas. He even mocked Herder's attempt to deduce brain function from posture, calling it a leap towards metaphysics. Kant saw the metaphysical ambition, but rejected it as scientifically unsound. But here's the twist. Maybe Kant was wrong to focus so much on the metaphysics. Perhaps the real value wasn't in Herder's grand theory, but in the way he conceived of history. The metaphysical bits were just the result of his core metaphor. After the revolution, people desperately needed a way to affirm their reality, whether they were conservatives or liberals. Herder's idea that everything has its own inherent rule of articulation could be applied to contemporary society. His Catholicity of appreciation, valuing everything without judgment, became the basis for a realistic historical consciousness in thinkers like Hegel, Balzac, Tocqueville, and Ranke. Organicism, stripped of its metaphysical claims, provided a satisfying way to understand both past and present for many established thinkers. To really understand Herder, we need to break down his system. It's not just one thing. There's his point of view, the voice he used, the formal theory of organicism, the story he told, and the underlying plot or myth. Kant nailed the critique of the formal theory, but he only touched one aspect. As a storyteller, Herder offered a powerful model for depicting history, a way of seeing the world that could be adopted by romantics, realists, and historists alike. It created a family of attitudes, all sharing Herder's fundamental approach to the historical data. First, Herder's voice. He wasn't a prophet scolding people for going astray. He was more like a priestly celebrant, reveling in the mystery of existence. He spoke for the victors of humanity, but also for his own contemporaries, sharing their values. Second, his point of view. He wasn't looking down on the past from a superior position, nor was he seeing his own age as a degraded version of something better, or a mere prelude to something greater. He celebrated the inherent virtue of the past, and extended that same respectful attitude to his own time. Virtue for him was presumed to exist across all eras. Third, the story he told. It's the story of things coming into being and passing away, driven by motifs of change, duration, growth, and fulfillment. This relies heavily on the root metaphor, the analogy between human life and plant life. Fourth, the plot structure or underlying myth. This is where comedy comes in, specifically the myth of providence. Herder argued that all the conflicts and disjunctions in history, when viewed properly, add up to a drama of reconciliation, divine, human, and natural, much like the biblical story of redemption. So, reading Herder gives you two effects: the metaphysical theory that clashes with formal philosophy, and the metaphorical identification of providence with plant life, ordering the story into a typical comedy. So, wrapping up this section, we saw the dominant Enlightenment tradition, driven by mechanism, leading to an ironic view and resulting in satirical representation, ultimately pointing towards absurdism and skepticism. Then there was the subdominant organicism, leading to a comic view, optimistic but ambiguous. Both arose reacting against earlier historical writing. But pushing these further led to a schism, a risk of mythification. Kant warned against this, suggesting aesthetics should provide the form for history for moral reasons. This tendency crystallized into Romanticism, defending the individual against the collective, and idealism, defending the collective against the individual. Both were reactions to the Enlightenment's own ironic impasse and the ambiguity of Herder's thought. That sets the stage for the next major shifts in historical thinking.